The night was dark, and the rain pounded against the small wooden house where I sat, typing away on my old typewriter. Outside, the world seemed to be falling apart, but inside, I was lost in a world of my own, a world where Elvis Presley lived and breathed through the words I wrote. My name is Sarah, and this is the story of how I came to write about Elvis, the king of rock and roll. It's a story that began long before I ever picked up a pen. It started in the small, sleepy town of Tupelo, Mississippi, where Elvis was born, and it ended up in my heart, making me feel like I was a part of something bigger than myself. It was a cold, rainy night when I first met Joe, my husband. He was sitting at a table in the corner of a crowded cafe, his face lit up by the soft glow of a lamp. I was new to town and I was nervous. But Joe had this way of making people feel at ease. He looked up from his book, smiled, and said, "Hey, you look like you could use a friend." And just like that, we became inseparable. Joe and I started a business together, but it never really felt like my calling. I was writing, sure, but it was all about practical things: marketing, copy, business plans, you name it. It was good, steady work, but it never set my soul on fire. Then one day, Joe sat down next to me at our writing table, put his hand on my shoulder, and said, "Sarah, you need to write about what you love, follow your heart." I looked at him, feeling a mix of excitement and fear. What I loved was Elvis Presley. I had been fascinated by him since I was a little girl, reading every book I could find about his life. But writing about Elvis, that seemed like a dream, not a reality. Joe saw the hesitation in my eyes and gave me a gentle push. "Just try it, Sarah, you won't regret it." And so I did. I started researching, interviewing people who had known Elvis, and diving deep into his world. It was a journey that would take me far from home, to places I had only read about in books. I would spend weeks at a time in Memphis, Tupelo, and even New Orleans, talking to people who had lived and breathed the same air as Elvis. Joe held down the fort while I was away, keeping our business running and taking care of our 4 daughters, Hope, June, Tess, and Jillian. They were my world, and the guilt of leaving them was real, but they understood and they supported me. They knew how much this meant to me, and they were my biggest cheerleaders. Every night, when I would sit down at my writing table, Joe would climb into bed, put a pillow over his head to block out the light and the sound of my typing, and say, "Keep up the good work, Sarah." It was his way of telling me that he was there for me, no matter what. The journey was not easy. I faced skepticism, doubt, and moments of sheer exhaustion. But every time I thought about giving up, I remembered the stories of the people I had met. People like Ron Strauss, the pilot of Elvis's plane, the Lisa Marie. Ron was a true American hero, a man who had seen the best and worst of the world, and yet he had always remained kind and humble. He shared his stories with me, and they fueled my passion to keep going. I met countless others who had known Elvis, people like Tish Henley Kirk, Barbara Hearn Smith, and Sherry Lacker. They were like a family to me, and they opened their hearts and homes to me. They told me stories that I had never heard before, stories that showed Elvis in a new light. He wasn't just a rock star. He was a human being, with all the joys and struggles that come with it. As I typed away on my typewriter, the rain outside seemed to fade into the background. The words flowed from my heart, and I felt a connection to Elvis that I had never felt before. It was more than just a project. It was a labor of love. I don't know where this journey will take me, or how many people will read this book, but I do know one thing. I am grateful for every moment of it. Grateful for the people who believed in me, for the stories that inspired me, and for the chance to write about a man who changed the world. And as I sit here, typing the last words of this chapter, I can hear Joe's voice in my head saying, "Keep up the good work, Sarah. You've got this." The rain outside has finally stopped, and the first light of dawn is beginning to peek through the window. It's a new day, and I'm ready to keep writing, because this is just the beginning. Elvis and I grew up in a time when life was simpler, but also tough. We were poor and money was always a concern, but we never felt like we were missing out. We had a strong sense of community. Our neighbors were like family, and we all helped each other out. I remember picking cotton with Elvis, and even though it was hard work, we always found a way to make it fun. We'd sing and joke around, trying to make the time pass faster. Guy Harris, one of Elvis's childhood friends, often talked about how we all lived in a close-knit community. We shared what little we had, and it was common to see everyone pitching in to help a family in need. The women in our neighborhood had big gardens, and they would always share their produce. Elvis's mom, Gladys, was known for her kindness. She was always willing to lend a hand or a listening ear. Even though we didn't have much, we never felt like we were lacking. Elvis had a deep respect for his parents, especially his mom. He would often talk about how much he loved her and how she supported him through everything, but life wasn't always easy for them. Elvis had health issues like asthma and tonsillitis, and sometimes he had to stay home from school. There was one terrible day when Elvis was really sick, and it was scary for everyone. His dad, Vernon, was always there to take care of him, but it was a tough time for the family. Despite the hardships, Elvis never lost his ambition. He dreamed of being a good person and making a difference. Even as a young boy, he would stay up late, practicing his guitar and singing. He was always trying to improve himself. His hair, for example, was something he took pride in. He would spend time styling it, and it became a part of his signature look. When Elvis and his family moved to Memphis, things started to change. Memphis was a bigger city, and there were more opportunities, but it was also more challenging. They lived in a small, cramped apartment, and money was still tight. Elvis's mom didn't like living in the city at first, but she adapted. She always made the best of what they had. The community in Memphis was just as close-knit as in Tupelo, and the neighbors would look out for each other. Elvis's dad worked hard to provide for the family, and Elvis did his part too. He would take on odd jobs and help out where he could. He was determined to make a better life for himself and his family. He started to listen to different types of music, from country to blues, and it all influenced his style. He would often talk about how he wanted to create something new, something that would capture people's hearts. One of the biggest turning points in Elvis's life was when he met Sam Phillips at Sun Records. Sam saw something special in Elvis and gave him a chance to record. The first time Elvis stepped into the studio, it was like magic. He was nervous but excited, and he poured his heart into every note. Sam and the other musicians could tell that Elvis was something different. They knew he had a unique talent that could change the music world. As Elvis's career began to take off, things got a bit complicated. The Colonel, Tom Parker, became his manager and started to shape his image. Elvis was still the same person, but the world around him was changing. He faced new challenges and pressures, but he never lost sight of who he was. He always remembered where he came from and the people who supported him. Elvis's mom, Gladys, was always his biggest fan. She was proud of his success, but also worried about the toll it might take on him. She would often remind him to stay grounded and true to himself. Elvis took her advice to heart. He knew that no matter how famous he became, he was still the same boy from Tupelo who dreamed of making a difference. Even as Elvis became a star, he never forgot his roots. He would often talk about the people who helped him along the way and the community that shaped him. He always wanted to give back and make a positive impact. Despite the challenges, Elvis's journey from a poor boy in Tupelo to the king of rock and roll is a story of perseverance, talent, and the power of dreams. Gladys, Elvis's mom, was getting sicker and sicker. She was a strong woman, a wife, a homemaker, and a mother, but her health started to fail. People who knew her in Tupelo remember her as a kind and generous person. She always put her family first. When the Presleys lived on Audubon Drive, Gladys's whole life revolved around her family. She was protective and loving, but as time went on, she began to show signs of illness. Gladys had dark circles under her eyes, and sometimes they were even sunken. Her hands swelled, and she had congestive heart failure. At 44, she was referred to a cardiologist, but her condition didn't improve. Dr. Clark, her doctor, tried his best but was perplexed by her symptoms. He called in 4 different specialists, but they couldn't agree on a diagnosis. Some suggested that Gladys might have had a rare genetic condition called alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency, which affects the liver and lungs. Elvis noticed that his mom was getting weaker. He told his friends, "Mama's not doing too well." It was clear that he was deeply worried. Gladys's health issues were making Elvis feel like he was losing her. He was torn between his career and his family. He wanted to be there for his mom, but he also had responsibilities as a rising star. When Gladys passed away, it was a devastating blow to Elvis. He was heartbroken. He talked about the body in the casket, saying it didn't look like his mom. He felt like a part of him died with her. The funeral was a difficult time for the Presleys. Elvis and his dad, Vernon, sat on the front porch and talked about Gladys. Elvis told his friend, "I think this is the end. I don't know if I can go on without her." Elvis's world changed after his mom's death. He was different, more serious. He joined the army, and it was a challenging time for him. He had to deal with the loss of his mom while serving his country. He talked to his friends a lot about how much he missed her. His cousin Junior, who died in 1960, and Uncle Travis, who had health issues, reminded him of how fragile life can be. When Elvis came back from Germany, he tried to rebuild his life. He started making movies and performing again, but things were never quite the same. He wanted to be a crooner, but some people criticized his new style. He handpicked his friends carefully, and he wanted them to treat Graceland like a home. He didn't want to be surrounded by fake people or strangers. Elvis's life was a mix of success and struggle. He had his ups and downs, but he always tried to stay true to himself. He loved gospel music and often talked about his faith. He was a complex person, and his friends and family saw different sides of him. He was a man who cared deeply about those he loved, but he also had his demons. He battled with sleep issues and sometimes relied on medication to cope. Elvis's world was intoxicating, but it was also isolating. He was a superstar, but he often felt alone. He and Priscilla fell more in love after they had Lisa Marie, and he was a devoted father. He wanted to create a happy home for his family, but the pressures of fame were always there. The '68 comeback special was a turning point for Elvis. He wanted to show the world that he was still relevant. He worked hard and put on a performance that people still talk about today. It was a moment of triumph, but it was also a reminder of how much he had been through. Elvis was a survivor, but he carried the weight of his past with him. Gladys's influence was always with him, and he never forgot her. She was the one who believed in him from the start, and her love and support were the foundation of his success. Even though she was gone, her memory lived on in everything he did. I remember when I first started working with Elvis. It was a job that went beyond my nursing duties. I became a part of his life, and we shared a lot. Elvis was a complex person, full of contradictions. One moment he could be the happiest man in the world, and the next, he'd be struggling with the weight of his fame and personal issues. Elvis's health was always a guessing game. Tish Henley Kirk, one of the nurses, told me that figuring out what was wrong with him was always a challenge. He had so many different ailments, from chronic sore throats to more serious conditions like Reiter's syndrome, which is a type of arthritis that can cause inflammation in various parts of the body. Elvis's medical history is well documented. He had head trauma, autoimmune issues, and chronic pain, all of which contributed to his early death. One of the most striking things about his health was how he managed to perform despite feeling so bad so often. He had a sore throat very often, and it was clear that this was a constant struggle for him. Elvis was a performer through and through. He did over 1,137 live shows across the country, and each one was a testament to his dedication. Sam Phillips, who helped launch his career, once said something that really stuck with me. He told Elvis, "You've got a voice that can touch the soul of anyone who listens." This was true, and it was evident in the way people responded to his performances. But the road was tough on Elvis. It wasn't just the physical toll of performing. It was the emotional strain of being away from home, the constant pressure, and the expectations. One of his friends, Lamar Fike, said that Elvis wanted to share his knowledge and experiences, but sometimes it felt like too much. Fike described how Elvis would give away cars and do nice things for people, but it was clear that he was trying to fill a void. Elvis's relationship with his fans was complex. He never wanted to turn down a fan, even if it meant sacrificing his own needs. This was part of his charm, but it also contributed to his exhaustion. He was a man who appeared to have it all, but the inside story was much different. He had a lot of pain and struggles, that no one saw on stage. The Memphis Mafia, the group of friends and associates who were always around Elvis, had a unique dynamic. They grew up together, and they were like a family. But even in this close-knit group, there were challenges. The women in the Mafia often had to handle things on their own, and it wasn't always easy. Despite this, Elvis was, in a strange way, a one-woman man. He had a deep need for connection, but he also had a hard time maintaining relationships because of his lifestyle. Elvis's marriage to Priscilla was one of the most public parts of his life. At times he was happy being married, but the road was punishing, and it took its toll on their relationship. Priscilla was often left at home while Elvis was on tour, and this strain eventually led to their divorce. It was a difficult time for both of them, and it was clear that Elvis was dealing with a lot of personal issues. Elvis's health issues continued to worsen. He had migraine headaches, iritis inflammation of the iris, and other chronic conditions. His appearance changed over time, and those close to him noticed how much he was suffering. His friend Joyce Bova was shocked by how ailing he looked. It was a stark contrast to the vibrant performer everyone knew. Despite all this, Elvis continued to perform. He was a professional, and he always gave his best, even when he was feeling terrible. His dedication was inspiring, but it was also heartbreaking to see him push himself so hard. The road was a double-edged sword for Elvis. It gave him the chance to connect with his fans, but it also took a toll on his health and well-being. In the end, Elvis's life was a mix of incredible highs and deep lows. He was a legend, but he was also a human being with his own struggles. Being part of his world was a privilege, but it was also a reminder of the price of fame. I remember a time when Elvis was just standing there on stage, and it was clear he was struggling. He was so tired, and it was hard for him to keep going. But he never wanted to show weakness, especially to his fans. He'd get Elvis back in there to pay some bills, even if he was exhausted. Sometimes he'd be 2 or 3 days where he couldn't talk properly, and it was heartbreaking to see. Dr. Nick, his doctor, tried to help him with a liquid nutrient supplement, but things were getting bad. Elvis retained so much water that after 1973, his body was almost unrecognizable. His health was failing, and it was hard for him to be the Elvis everyone knew. He'd get embarrassed when he had to talk about his health issues, but he knew something was terribly wrong with his body. One of the hardest things for Elvis was his constant pain. His breathing was labored, and his blood pressure would spike under stress. He'd often say, "I'm not going out there," but the pressure to perform was too much. He was a strong individual, but the drugs were taking over. Methaqualone and Valium were both tranquilizers that he used, and it was affecting his speech and movements. In the mid-70s, doctors were just starting to understand the dangers of these drugs, but it was too late for Elvis. He knew he was in trouble, but he couldn't stop. His eyes would often glaze over, and he'd look like a different person. He told Kathy how his eyes would hurt, and it was clear he was suffering. Elvis was very protective of his close friends and family. He never wanted them to see him in pain, but it was impossible to hide. He'd get so tired that he'd say, "Just get me to the damn city," and it was heartbreaking. His body was failing him, and he knew it. During one show in Tahoe, he had to stop halfway through because he was in so much pain. His breathing was labored, and his blood pressure was through the roof. Vernon, his dad, and Dr. Nick talked about his health, but there was only so much they could do. Elvis was a complex person, and his addiction was hard to break. He'd often say, "I can't remember the last time I felt good," and it was clear he was struggling. His bodyguard, Ed Parker, noticed how much he had changed. He was in so much pain, and it was obvious to everyone around him. On the last show, Larry Geller was doing Elvis' hair, and Elvis said, "This is it, Larry. This is the last one." It was a moment that no one will ever forget. The concert was thought to be one of his last, and it was clear he was not feeling well. He looked like a different person, and it was hard to watch. After the show, Billy, one of his closest friends, said, "Elvis, this is going to be a long night." And it was. Elvis was very ill, and we all knew it. He was in so much pain, and it was like he was saying goodbye. It was a moment that will stay with me forever. Elvis' death was a shock to everyone, Priscilla and Lisa Marie were devastated. Priscilla ran to Lisa, and they placed a photo of Elvis in her room. It was a way to keep him close, even though he was gone. His family and friends were in deep pain, and it was hard to move on. Elvis was a good man, and he was kind to everyone. But his struggles were too much, and it was the end of an era. I remember the day I learned about Elvis Presley's last moments. It was a mix of sadness and curiosity. I read about it in a book called The King and Dr. Nick: What Really Happened to Elvis and Me, by Dr. George Nishapoulos and Rose Clayton Phillips. Dr. Nick, as he was known, was Elvis's personal doctor for many years, and he shared a lot of personal stories about Elvis's life and death. Elvis had a lot of health issues, and one of the things that bothered him was that codeine made him itchy. He didn't like that feeling, so he avoided it. Dr. Nick said that codeine alone wouldn't cause someone to die suddenly. When you overdose on codeine, your lungs can fill up with fluid, but that wasn't what happened to Elvis. He had been taking a lot of different medications every day, but none of them were known to be life-threatening on their own. The night before Elvis died, he got some medication packs. He often took these to help him sleep or manage his pain. Dr. Nick mentioned that Elvis's heart was really big, which is a sign of a lot of stress on the body. His liver was also unhealthy, which is a sign of long-term drug use and other health issues. One of the things that surprised me was that Elvis's colon was very large. Dr. Nick explained that if your colon gets that big, it can be really hard to go to the bathroom. This is something Elvis struggled with a lot. He would strain really hard, which could put a lot of pressure on his heart. There's a medical term for this called the Valsalva maneuver. It's what happens when you hold your breath and push really hard, like when you're trying to lift something heavy or go to the bathroom. Dr. Nick and other doctors thought that this might have been what caused Elvis's heart to stop. Elvis's last moments were really tough. He was straining so hard that it might have triggered a heart attack. Some people think that if he had been using other drugs like cocaine, it might have been different, but the autopsy didn't show any evidence of that. The doctors who examined him said that his body was in such bad shape that even a small thing could have been the final straw. Dr. Nick believed that Elvis knew he was going to die. He had talked about it with his friends and family. It's a sad thought, but it's clear that Elvis was dealing with a lot of physical and emotional pain. I also read about how Elvis's family and friends remembered him. They said he was only human, just like everyone else. He had his struggles, but he was also incredibly talented and loved by so many people. Even though he's gone, his music and his legacy continue to inspire people all over the world. It's a bit overwhelming to think about how much Elvis went through, but it's also a reminder that even the biggest stars can face their own battles. It's important to take care of our health and to be there for each other, just like Elvis's friends and family were for him. Elvis Presley's life was full of highs and lows, and his health was no exception. I remember reading about how his mother, Gladys, struggled with tuberculosis, a disease that was once called the White Plague. It was a time when many people, especially in rural areas like Mississippi, had limited access to medical care. Tuberculosis was a major concern back then, and it affected many families, including the Presleys. Elvis himself faced a number of health issues throughout his life. One of the most interesting things I learned was that he might have had a genetic condition called alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency. This condition can cause serious lung and liver problems, and it's something that can run in families. It's a bit like a hidden weakness that can make you more susceptible to certain illnesses. Some people with this condition don't even know they have it until they start having health problems. Another thing that struck me was Elvis's use of prescription drugs. His doctor, Dr. George C. Nishapoulos, was known for prescribing a lot of medication. Some people say that Elvis's drug use contributed to his early death. It's a sad part of his story, but it also shows how much pressure he was under. Being a famous celebrity can be really tough, and it's easy to see how someone might turn to drugs to cope with the stress. Elvis's health issues also included chronic constipation, which might sound funny, but it can be really serious. His friend Billy Smith talked about how Elvis struggled with this problem. It's a reminder that even the most famous people can have very human, sometimes embarrassing, health issues. Elvis's immune system was also a point of interest. Some experts believe that his immune system was weakened by all the stress and medication he was taking. This made him more vulnerable to infections and other health problems. It's a complex picture, and it's hard to pinpoint just one thing that led to his early death. Elvis's family history also played a role in his health. His parents, Vernon and Gladys, talked about the challenges they faced raising him. They were a close-knit family, but they also had their share of hardships. For example, Elvis's twin brother, Jesse Garin, died at birth. This was a big loss for the family and might have had a lasting impact on Elvis's life. Elvis's relationships were also a big part of his life. He had a lot of close friends like Red West and Larry Geller, who were there for him through the good times and the bad. These friends often talked about how Elvis would confide in them about his health issues and the pressures of fame. They were a source of support and comfort for him. One of the most touching stories I read was about how Elvis said goodbye to his mother. John Donne wrote about this in a magazine article, and it's a powerful moment that shows how much Elvis cared for his family. It's a reminder that despite all his fame and success, Elvis was just a regular person who loved his family deeply. Elvis's legacy is still felt today, not just in music but in the way people think about health and fame. His story is a mix of incredible talent, personal struggles, and the challenges of living in the spotlight. It's a reminder that even the most famous people have their own battles to fight. I remember the day I watched Speedway for the first time, exactly 50 years after its release. Elvis Presley was more than just an actor to me. He was a legend, and the film brought back so many memories. I was there on set, working with Elvis, and it felt like yesterday. His charm, his talent, and his energy were infectious. We laughed a lot, and even though the movie wasn't a huge hit, it was a special time for me. Elvis was always professional, but he had this way of making everyone feel at ease. It was one of the many things I admired about him. Elvis's journey wasn't just about the music and the movies. He had a manager, Colonel Tom Parker, who played a significant role in his career. Colonel Parker was a complex figure, known for his shrewd business sense and his sometimes controversial methods. He had his own amazing comeback story, rising from a difficult past to become one of the most influential managers in the entertainment industry. His relationship with Elvis was often rocky, but there is no denying that he helped shape Elvis into the icon we know today. Looking back, Elvis's life was a mix of incredible highs and heartbreaking lows. He faced challenges that few could understand, from the pressures of fame to personal losses. Despite everything, he always managed to come back stronger. His music, his presence, and his spirit continue to inspire generations. On a different note, I've learned a lot about health over the years. One thing that stands out is the importance of understanding our bodies. For example, I read about steroids and how they can affect the adrenal gland. It's fascinating how these tiny glands can have such a big impact on our health. Steroids can be life-saving, but they need to be used carefully to avoid serious side effects. It's a reminder that taking care of ourselves is crucial, no matter how busy or successful we become. In history, there are stories that are both fascinating and a bit unsettling. The Habsburg family, for instance, is known for its powerful rule and its unusual physical traits. The Habsburg jaw, a prominent lower jaw, was a result of generations of inbreeding. It's a stark reminder of the dangers of marrying within a small family circle. While it's a part of history, it's also a cautionary tale about the importance of genetic diversity. Reflecting on these stories, I realize that life is full of lessons. Whether it's the rise and fall of a music icon, the complexities of a business relationship, the importance of health, or the consequences of history, there's always something to learn. I'm grateful for the experiences I've had and the people I've met along the way. They've all contributed to the person I am today. So as I look back on my journey, I'm filled with gratitude and a sense of wonder. Life is a series of moments, some big, some small, but all of them important. And in the end, it's the connections we make and the lessons we learn that truly matter.